General Audience number 84 of July 7th, 1982. During last Wednesday's meeting, we tried to reach a deeper grasp of the argumentation St. Paul uses in 1 Corinthians to convince his audience that the one who chooses marriage does well, while the one who chooses virginity, or continence according to the spirit of the Evangelical Council, does better. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 38. As we continue this meditation today, let us recall that according to St. Paul, quote, the unmarried man is anxious about how to please the Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32. Pleasing the Lord has love as its background. This background becomes visible in a further comparison. The one who is not married is anxious about how to please God, while the married man must be anxious also about how to satisfy his wife. The spousal character of, quote, continence for the kingdom of God becomes in some way apparent here. Man always tries to please the person he loves. Quote, pleasing God is thus not without that which is distinctive of the interpersonal relationship of spouses. On the one hand, pleasing is an effort on man's part who tends toward God and seeks how to please him. That is, how to express love in an active way. On the other hand, to this aspiration of pleasing, there corresponds the good pleasure of God, who, accepting a man's efforts, crowns his own work by giving a new grace. From the beginning, in fact, this aspiration has been his gift. Quote, being anxious about how to please God is thus a contribution by man to the continued dialogue of salvation begun by God. It is evident that every Christian who lives by faith takes part in this dialogue. Paul observes, however, that the man who is bound by the marriage bond, quote, finds himself divided, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34, because of his family duties. See 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34. From this observation, it seems thus to follow that the unmarried person should be characterized by an inner integration, by a unification that would allow him to devote himself completely to the service of the kingdom of God in all its dimensions. This attitude presupposes abstention from marriage, exclusively, quote, for the kingdom of God, and a life directed uniquely to this goal. Otherwise, division can secretly enter also the life of an unmarried person, who, being deprived on the one hand of married life, and on the other hand of a clear goal for which he should renounce marriage, could find himself faced with a certain void. The apostle seems to know all this well, and takes pains to make clear that he does not want to, quote, cast a snare on the one whom he counsels not to marry, but he does so to direct him to what is worthy and keeps him united with the Lord without distractions. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35. These words bring to mind what Christ said to the apostles, according to Luke, during the Last Supper. Quote, you are those who stood by me in my trials, literally in temptations, and I am preparing a kingdom for you, just as the Father has prepared it for me. Luke chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, in John Paul II's interpolation. The unmarried person, quote, being united with the Lord, can be certain that his difficulties will be met with understanding. Quote, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has similarly been tested in every way, yet without sin. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. This allows the unmarried person not so much to immerse himself exclusively in possible personal problems, but rather to include them in the great stream of the sufferings of Christ and his body, which is the church. The apostle shows how one can be, quote, united with the Lord. One can reach this by aspiring to dwell constantly with him, to rejoice in his presence, euparedron, without letting oneself be distracted by non-essential matters, aperipastos. See 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35. Paul unfolds this thought even more clearly when he speaks about the situation of the married woman and of the one who has chosen virginity or no longer has a husband. While the married woman must be anxious about, quote, how to please her husband, the unmarried one, quote, is anxious about what is the Lord's, to be holy in body and spirit. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 34. In order to grasp the whole depth of Paul's thought in an adequate manner, one must observe that holiness, according to the biblical conception, is a state rather than an action. It has, first of all, an ontological character, and then also a moral one. Especially in the Old Testament, it is a separation from what is not subject to God's influence, from what is profane, in order to belong only to God. Holiness in body and in spirit, thus, also signifies the sacredness of virginity or celibacy accepted for the kingdom of God. And at the same time, what is offered to God must distinguish itself by moral purity, and thus presupposes a way of acting, quote, without spot or wrinkle, holy and immaculate, according to the virginal model of the church standing before Christ. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 27. In this chapter of 1 Corinthians, the apostle touches on the problems of marriage and celibacy, or virginity, in a deeply human and realistic way, realizing the mentality of the recipients of his letter. Paul's argumentation is to some extent ad hominem. In the environment of his addressees in Corinth, the new world, the new order of values that he announces, had to encounter another world and another order of values, different also from the one to which the words spoken by Christ were first addressed. When Paul, with his teaching about marriage and continence, appeals also to the transitoriness of the world and of human life in it, he certainly does so in reference to the environment that was in some sense programmatically oriented toward use of the world. From this point of view, his appeal to, quote, those who make use of the world, that they might do it as if they made no use of it, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31, is very significant. From the immediate context, it is clear that in this environment, even marriage was understood as a way of using the world in a manner different from how it was in the whole Israelite tradition, despite some deformations which Jesus indicated in his dialogue with the Pharisees and in the Sermon on the Mount. Undoubtedly, all this explains the style of Paul's answer. The apostle clearly realized that when he encouraged abstinence from marriage, he had to highlight at the same time a way of understanding marriage that would be in agreement with the whole evangelical order of values. And he had to do so with the greatest realism, that is, keeping in mind the environment of those to which he was addressing himself, the ideas and ways of evaluating things that were dominant in it. To people who lived in an environment where marriage was considered above all as one of the ways of making use of the world, Paul thus expressed himself with significant words, both about virginity or celibacy, as we have seen, and about marriage itself. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is well for them to remain as I am. But if they do not know how to live in continence, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be a flame. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 and 9. Paul expressed almost the same idea a little earlier. Quote, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Still, because of the danger of incontinence, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Concupiscence and gift from God. Does the apostle in 1 Corinthians see marriage only from the point of view of remedium concupiscentiae, remedy for concupiscence, as one used to say in traditional theological language? The statements quoted a little earlier would seem to attest to this. However, right next to the formulations just quoted, we read a sentence that leads us to see the whole of St. Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 differently. Quote, I wish that all were as I myself am. He repeats his favorite argument for abstaining from marriage. But each has his own gift from God, one in one way and another in another. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7. Thus, also those who choose marriage and live in it receive a gift from God, their own gift. That is the grace proper to this choice, of this way of living, of this state. The gift received by persons who live in marriage is different from the one received by persons who live in virginity and choose continence for the kingdom of God. Nevertheless, it is a true gift from God, a gift that is one's own, destined for concrete persons, and specific, that is, adapted to their vocation in life. One can therefore say that while the apostle, in his characterization of marriage from the human side, and perhaps even more from the side of the dominant local situation in Corinth, strongly highlights the motivation in view of the concupiscence of the flesh, at the same time he brings out, and with no less strength of conviction, also its sacramental and charismatic character. With the same clarity with which he sees man's situation in relation to the concupiscence of the flesh, he also sees the action of grace in every human being, in the one who lives in marriage no less than the one who voluntarily chooses continence, keeping in mind that the, quote, stage of this world is passing away.